We'll formally welcome everyone to tonight's talk as part of Stirling Photography Festival's Stories 2022 festival. I'm delighted to welcome Ted to lead a Zoom talk with us tonight. Ted also held a talk for us last year, which was wonderful. So we're absolutely delighted that Ted could do that for us again tonight. Some of you will know of Ted. Ted is an award-winning landscape photographer. He works in partnership with Morag as the partnership Leeming and Patterson. They spend their time between Scotland and Italy, and we'll probably get a little bit of an insight into that tonight as Ted works us through his projects. It seemed very fitting when we were invited to partner with Stirling University's Festival of Biodiversity, that Ted should lead a talk for us, because Ted has turned his lens on the environmental impact of man and the question of our own practice, his own practice, both in terms of his professional practice as a photographer and some lifestyle choices, and encouraging us to think about how we can develop our own practice to be more sustainable, or indeed just question our own lifestyles and our sustainability. So tonight, Ted's going to take his talk in 3 parts, and I'll let Ted outline those to you. But it's a 3-chunk presentation this evening. And at the end of each little piece, Ted will take questions on that particular section of his talk. So if you want to drop your questions into chat as you go, then we'll make sure we don't miss them and you don't miss them. But we will just mark those breaks in the chat, and Ted will take your questions at that point. So as we're listening to Ted, it would be nice for us just to consider how we might raise awareness of the challenge to our environment and biodiversity as we're listening to Ted, and how might we contribute to the change that we need to see. So without further ado, I would just like to hand over to Ted. I'll take instructions from Ted at various points, because he'd like me to copy things into chat for you to view on your own browsers. But at this point, Ted, I'll hand over to you, and thank you very much. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Janie, for a more than generous introduction, and welcome everybody. I think my talk last year was titled Elbow Patches of the New Black, was it not, Janie? And I just wanted to show that indeed I am putting elbow patches on my clothes. Anyway, welcome everybody to this evening. Instead of having to look at me for the rest of the night, I'm going to very quickly move towards a screen share and start the slideshow. Just bear with me 1 second. Here we go. Can everybody see that? That's great. Okay. So what I would actually like to start with is a quote from Nan Shepherd. Now, Nan Shepherd was an amazing lady. She wandered the Cairngorm Mountains long ago in the 19th century, the 20th century, sorry. But she was never driven by destination and the summit. She was always fascinated by everything that was around her. Mm-hmm. And when I read this quote, it's probably been the most significant message that I've had, and the most influential message that I've had in my practice for the last decade. I spent a lot of time when I started out always traveling lots of places to get to distant venues. But I actually realized, and hopefully it will come across a little bit tonight, that actually when I started looking around me and what we had close to home, that there was absolutely no need for that. Now, I'm sorry, I'm trying to, there we go. The talk this evening, though, I'm going to split into 3 separate parts. And the first part is really a little bit about my own journey towards sustainability, both with respect to our lifestyle and with respect to our practice. Following that, we'll take a few questions. And then we'll come back and look at two separate projects that I worked on in 2021 during the lockdown. And these are both directly relevant to the biodiversity theme. And so without further ado, I think we'll move into the first section. And this is one of the nice things about being online, is that we can chop and change a little bit. So Janie's already mentioned two questions that if you want to, you can put into the chat answers to these questions. How can we better raise awareness with respect to biodiversity loss? And also, how can we better contribute to being the solution and the change? And what I'm going to do just before we get into the meat of the project is I'm going to hand you back to Janie just to put in the chat a little link to a 90-second time-lapse photo that Morag did, just to get us in the mood for the evening. So I'll hand back to you, Janie.
Thank you, Ted. I'm going to copy this Vimeo link into your chat, and if you could view it through your own browser by clicking on it or cutting and pasting it into your own browser. It's just 90 seconds long, so we'll come back together in a couple of minutes. Okay, everyone, hopefully you've all had a chance to view that. Thank you, Ted.
Great. Okay, thanks very much. Well, the reason that I posted that little timeline is that it actually formed part of the first project that I'm going to discuss tonight. And that project was called Zerofootprints. But just before we go into Zerofootprints, just to give you a bit more background, I've been a climate activist since really the late 80s. And in 1990, I effectively became a volunteer looking to promote the development of renewables in the United Kingdom as part of the solution to climate change. And for a decade, I worked in that industry. I actually ended up setting up a consultancy in renewable energies with a friend of mine. But at the turn of the century, I actually thought, well, if I'm talking about this subject matter, then I really should, and being an advocate of it, then I really should be living it as well. And so I started looking at my own life and how I could actively do more to become more sustainable. And Morag and I, the first thing we did was decide to design and build our own low energy house. And that's the project that you see here. We were very lucky, bought a plot in a very remote location in southwest Scotland, in Galloway. And it really was a 3-4 year project from its concept to its delivery. We learned a lot, we made a lot of mistakes, but it was great fun, and we continue to live in this house to this day. And whilst we were building it, we thought, well, wouldn't it be nice to do a photography project rather than traveling all over the world to take photos, to actually do a photography project that was in keeping with the house project itself. And the concept that we came up with was called Zerofootprint, and every photo had to be taken from exactly the same location, thus minimizing and avoiding any transport footprint more normally associated with photography. And you can see here the patio outside the kitchen door was the chosen location, and you can see the view that we have from the house at that point. Now, at the time, we were still quite traditional, what I would just call landscape photographers. And so a lot of our depictions of the landscape were really trying to express the landscape in the best terms that we could. So whilst we have a view from the house here, and it's a very lovely view, it isn't a particularly beautiful landscape photo. So if I now press the button, you should see exactly the same view at a different time of year, when the light is completely different time of day, to create the final image that we felt represented that particular part of the scene. And this was a really interesting process to have to go through, because it meant that we had to really look at the landscape around us. And indeed, not only were we seeing changes in season, time of day, weather, but we were also seeing changes in the actual landscape itself over time. Now, I've always thought that the landscape was a fairly static thing, and it's one of those things that you can rely on. But here's a good example of how something can change very dramatically overnight. You see the larch stand of plantation in the foreground here. Well, one day we woke up and literally it had been ripped apart. And this for us was a revelation, not just with respect that the landscape is in a constant state of change, but also this image is quite important for us, because it actually was one of the first images that we took that really encapsulated the fact that the climate was changing. This was a 100-year unprecedented event at the time, and it's become really quite symbolic for both of us with respect to our journey. Now, that initial project lasted for approximately 5 years. We were looking at that single view in our landscape, so we became very familiar with it. But we really wanted to close the project in some shape or form, rather than just have a bunch of files on the laptop. And so we actually created a book, and this is just an idea of that, the printing process that we went through. But that wasn't the end of the project. And interestingly, it has informed literally everything we've done ever since, not just with respect to our work practice, but also with respect to our lifestyle as well. So in this image, we moved to our house in Italy. It's in Liguria, which is sort of northwest. We're in the Maritime Alps, where the house is at about 800 meters, looking straight down towards the Mediterranean, as you see in this view. Very rural location, as with the other house. And we're still shooting that landscape Zerofootprint project. But what we're actually finding is that we're starting to realize that landscape in a different way, because we've become much more involved in the environment and the issues around us. We're actually finding that those are starting to come forward in the types of images we're shooting. So we're not trying to romanticize the landscape anymore. We're trying to depict it in terms of the weather that we're witnessing there, the changing weather. I mentioned an unprecedented event with respect to Scotland. Well, within 50 miles of our house in Italy, we've witnessed 300-year events in the last 5 years. So this is really something that's happening, and this is still the view from the house, looking in a different direction, actually watching these storms as they pass us by, and actually we're involved with them. There was one particular storm we had where we literally had to hide in the basement as big holes appeared in the roof and the tiles were being ripped off the roof, and we actually had saucepans over our heads as we went from upstairs down into the basement to hide. So it's a very real, this, and we were witnessing it. And we're also trying to look at the consequences or the causes of this. So this particular image is the lights at night of the local town at the bottom, Imperia, and the villages around about. So our use of energy and the emissions of CO2 causing these consequential effects. And I think with respect to these particular projects, they've really started to inform the way that we think. At the same time as we were running those projects, we were also running a very successful workshop business. And we were taking people, so what we were doing was we were going to exotic locations. Here we are in Iceland. We used to do the Faroes and various others. And we would go to those locations, take photos, put them on social media, and invite people to come on workshops with us to those locations. And it was fantastic, but we did become increasingly nervous about the carbon footprint associated with these locations. So we started offsetting. At our small holding in Scotland, we planted between 3,000 and 5,000 trees. And we also put monies into offsetting schemes, accredited offsetting schemes online. And that was the way that for a while, it felt as though we were addressing the issue. And indeed, it's still portrayed as being a way of assessing or offsetting our carbon footprints. Now, the other thing, this is the most amazing waterfall at Godafoss in Iceland. It still makes my heart beat when I see any images of Iceland. I utterly love Iceland. I could easily go and live there for an extended period of time. And this was one of the first trips that we went there. And if you look very hard in the top left, I'll try and put my cursor up there, you will see there is one person in this landscape and a very rough dirt track going up to the waterfall. And then if I click on to the next image, this is just a few years later, you suddenly had exponentially more people arriving. You have a very clear footpath that leads people up to, and it was a covered footpath. You have railings going across to protect, well, I'm not sure whether it's to protect the environment or the people from the nacelles falling over the cliffs, but there's another one over on this side as well. But certainly when we first started going to Iceland, you could pretty much clamber over any rocks, do anything you wanted. But the growth in visitor numbers was causing significant pressures on the environment. So they had to introduce measures, and they did it very sensitively to allow people still to go and see these places, but to also protect the environment. But I got very interested in these tourist numbers that I was seeing increase. And so I started doing a bit of research into it. And if you look at this slide, if you go back to 1950, the bottom left-hand corner of the slide, you see there was just over 4,000 people visiting Iceland in any given year. Fast forward to 2018, so the year just before the pandemic, you've got over 2.3 million people visiting Iceland. And if we look at this graph, if I bring the cursor over again, this is 2009, 2010, the credit crunch. We started doing our workshops in about this period here, when there was about 600,000 people a year visiting the country. So what we were seeing on the ground wasn't just my imagination. that exponential growth, we're seeing best part of 1.5 to 2 million people increase over maybe a 6, 7, 8 year period. It was a phenomenal change. And so I started thinking, well, is there a link between this increase in tourists and climate? And so I went, this is a graph by NASA. Now, this looks at climate change over the last 400,000 years. And it shows absolutely that our climate has changed immeasurably over that time in waves. That's the jagged line. So we've seen increases and decreases in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere constantly over the last 400,000 years. But the interesting thing is if you move to the right-hand side of this graph, see that same date, 1950, and you see the increase from then to today in the amount of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere. So what has happened since 1950 to the current day is completely different from anything else that's happened for the last 400,000 years. And that got me thinking even further and doing even more research to see if there were any other trends that seemed to link with this issue that I had raised. And in fact, there's many, many examples of this same exponential curve. So as population increases, GDP increases, I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can see the curve is exactly the same. And the one that I will focus on, because it's relevant to the biodiversity discussion that I'll be introducing later in the talk, is species extinctions. So as you see these increases in our lifestyles of modern society, you are seeing also an increase not only in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but also with respect to biodiversity, a massive increase in the extinctions of species, which is the green line that you see to the left. Now, all these things together got me thinking. Remember 1990 when I was a volunteer activist? This was when all the countries of the world were saying we can solve climate change and setting those targets to reduce carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere. Well, I hate to say it, and this is my doom and gloom slide of the presentation, and we'll get on to nicer stuff after this. But since 1990, so 32 years, over half of all the gases contributing to climate change have been emitted into the atmosphere. So this has happened on our watch, everybody. This is a generational issue. It's not a legacy history issue. It is something that has happened literally in the lifetime of the majority of people that are probably watching this. And this absolutely blew our minds. And we made a decision, both Morag and myself, that we had to change the way that we were running our practice, because we found that we were part of the problem and not part of the solution. And the first thing we did was look at our values and our purpose, who we were as people and as our practice. And once we had set them, we then started looking at how we can make changes to actually address some of the issues that had raised. Now, if you look down in the bottom right-hand corner, this was one of the first things that I did, because I had this whole series of slides of Iceland and elsewhere that I'd named as beautiful things to encourage people to come on our workshops. And actually, the first project I did was rename some of these, just one second, renamed some of these slides to more fit with how I was feeling at the time. And this was a fascinating project to do for me, because instantly I realized that just by changing a few words, you can utterly change the meaning of the image that you are presenting to the viewer, and therefore how they receive it. And you will see on a number of the slides that come up, not all of them, that they have names that help aid in the viewer in how they receive the image. I don't do it for all of them, but it just helps in some of my projects. And then we looked at all the things that we could do to change our practice. And they weren't all negative things. We weren't looking at, turning ourselves into, going back to the medieval ages. What we were looking at was actually one of the key ones we did. I won't again go through all of these in detail, but we decided we wanted to live a life that we didn't need to go on holiday from, and therefore not how much can we possibly go out and earn in our lives, but how much do we need to live a good life? And then we could devote ourselves to projects that we wanted to be doing where we wanted to be. And this has been our mantra ever since that time. And for myself, that has led to a major area of working being related to climate change, looking not only at the causes and the consequences of climate change, but more proactively. And I think this is something that increasingly I'm going to get involved in and look at, is solutions that we can all be a part of that change and helping to raise awareness. But this image for me, very much with it's the end of a road, not only symbolically for us with respect to Iceland, which we can no longer go back to really, but also just with respect to the themes of the ice and the snow melting. So now I visit my practice in a completely different way. I'm no longer a landscape photographer. I now consider myself an environmental photographer, but I'm also drawing on my academic studies in geography and anthropology as I complete my works. And one of the ways I do that is each year I try for about a month a year to immerse myself in a landscape. And this particular project that you're looking at now was actually, I had a meeting in Scotland and took the train up to have the meeting, but then I commuted a new e-bike that I'd purchased back to Italy, took a ferry from Newcastle to Amsterdam, and then followed the course of the Rhine through the Alps and back home. And what I found was that I was recording, I was responding to the environment that I was seeing in front of me and recording what was important to me rather than seeking out landscapes that with a romantic feel. So as you can see, the types of images that I'm shooting now has changed significantly. This particular image is on a separate immersion just before the pandemic. I cycled conversely from the Dead Sea in Romania, Constanta, up to the source of the Danube. This is actually Belgrade. Beograd in Serbia, recently acceded to the EU. And you see the corporations have taken a grip of this country. You can see all on the skyline, the advertising, huge advertising hoardings as they, and the growth, the number of cranes in this capital city was huge. And it was in stark contrast to what I've been seeing further down. So on the left bank here, you've got Bulgaria. On the right-hand bank, you've got Romania, two ex-Soviet countries, and a very different feel to those that I feel that you could only possibly see if you were actually slowly traveling through either by foot or by bike. I don't think I'd have had the same experience if I'd been traveling anyway, any other way. So we're not just looking at, that was really just a quick one on some of the causes, very quickly looking at some of the consequences of our actions. And this was just an image. The titling at the bottom might help give you an idea as to what I'm trying to express with this image. But it was really the idea, if we keep pumping fertilizers and pesticides into our fields, the impacts that will have on an ongoing basis. We've already seen some of that in some of the slides. And we're exploring weather themes, with respect to this. You've already seen some of that. And also this was in 2018, I did a 230-kilometer trek in the Maritime Alps. And this was another one of those 100-year unprecedented events where a storm had passed through, a very local storm. It was about 10 miles long, 15 kilometers long, and it had just destroyed this entire mature beech forest on top of the ridge. And I had to pick my way through trying to find my route. Actually, storms are a natural thing, don't get me wrong, and they can be a positive force as well for the biodiversity within the forest. And then the other side of it is looking at the solutions-based, and of which are all important if we're to move forward and not just look backwards. And it's recognizing that actually nothing does come for free. We live a lifestyle, and there's a consequence to us having that lifestyle in terms of the requirements that have to be delivered by third parties to allow us to be looking at these computer screens. Indeed, energy consumption is one of the biggest causes of carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere. But if you go to renewables, they have their own impacts on the environment that you have to consider. And these are just subject areas. I'm not saying there's any panacea to addressing issues. I'm raising points with respect to the individual solutions and allowing the viewer, hopefully, to better understand what their choices are with respect to the different opportunities. And so I'm going to close this section just by saying very quickly that having made these decisions quite some time ago, all I can say is that I wish, the only regret I have is that I didn't do it 25 years ago. It's been an amazing experience and actually been a hugely inspiring and positive experience. And so I think I'll just leave it on that and just come back to you, Janie, and see if we've got any questions come up in the chat.
Let me just scroll. No questions thus far. Mariana has commented on how beautiful your images, your zero footprint images were, and the video piece that Morag had made. And she's pointing out that there are also beautiful river landscapes in Belgrade too. So she's just raising that point. I did have a question for you around your zero footprints.
Actually, just before I get to that, that's a really interesting point that's been raised there, though, because there are indeed, everybody sees the environment in different ways. So what I've been finding is the way that I'm looking at the environment for the camera is very much addressing issues that I'm looking at with respect to my practice. I'm not searching out pretty images to show them off. I'm not saying they're not there. Another photographer, any photographer that did exactly the same trip would be seeing the world in different ways. And that's the beauty of art, is that we don't all see the world in the same, through the same lens.
Thanks, Ted. Just as this part was about your zero footprints journey, I'm wondering whether it's a project that's continuing. I understand you're continuing with that project. The benefit of hindsight, what are the greatest lessons you might share with the audience tonight around the biggest and most impactful decisions that you've made that I guess we might learn from? Yeah,
it's a very interesting question, and the answer would be very different for everybody. We, for example, we haven't said we've given up flying. For example, we have made a conscious decision that every time we think we may wish to fly, we say, do we need to fly or do we just want to do it? And so if there was a family event, an emergency, or a reason why I had to make a flight, I would absolutely do it. But I think about it very hard. and we haven't had any reason to fly for a long time. But it's completely different for other. But I think the most valuable lesson that I've learned that I could impart is that once you start thinking about this and actively engaging in looking at your own footprint and how you may seek to reduce it, it actually becomes very engaging and exciting thing to do. And that's why I said at the end of this that I just wish I'd looked at it earlier, because I think I would encourage people just to look and explore what does work for them, because it can be very exciting.
Thank you. And we have a question here from Kirsten, who's asking, did you do the bike ride down the Rhine on your own? No, that particular one I did with a very good friend. In fact, it was the friend I started my renewable energy company with back in 1996. We're still very good friends. For some peculiar reason, we never fell out. And so no, I shared that experience with him, but the trek I did on my own. That lasted between 3 and 4 weeks, and it was amazing. It's a very different experience doing something on your own as opposed to with someone else. You do see the world in a different way. I actually spent a year living in a camper van when I set up my landscape practice. And I now know, for example, that after about 4 days, I start talking to myself out loud quite freely. And you would never know certain things about yourself unless you spend time alone. So, and when I did that walk, I saw the landscape in a very different way than when I actually have done immersions with other people. So I've done both. I love both. I'm not particularly drawn to either. It's just what happens on each one. Thank you. Sounds like an all-round wonderful life experience. I have a question about your Zero Footprint project and whether or not there is a community you're building around that theme. Today, I was in a workshop with an environmental artist, Scott Hunter, who is developing ecological darkroom practices, and he's looking to build a community of people who are looking at this and interested in it, a virtual community through hashtag. Do you have any communities around your Zero Footprint, Ted? Is it something you're doing just as a personal project, you and Morag, or are you building a community around the notion?
Well, certainly put me in touch, because I'd love to speak to him about it. We did actually try this a few years ago, and I think the website still exists, and it's called zerofootprints.org. So Zero Footprints with an S on it.org, where we invited a whole range of photographers, submitted images to the website, which are still on the website, available for sale, and all the proceeds, they donated them free of charge. All the proceeds after printing costs went to carbon offset charities. So that was, and we ran competitions with no prizes because we're trying not to be a consumer entity. And we did set up a Facebook page and an Instagram page, but it never really took off. And I think you have to get these things when the timing is right. And it may just be that we could look at revitalizing that again. So I'd be very interested in exploring that. I think collaboration is one of the big areas that I want to get involved in moving forward. So yeah, very happy to talk about that.
And should anyone who's here tonight wish to contact you, Ted, your contact details are on your Leeming and Patterson website, yes?
Absolutely, they are, yes.
That's
about
great.
Anything relating to either the talk, if they want to go on their own journey with their practice towards sustainability, very, very happy to talk to them, or the Zero Footprints.